Welcome to the Probate Realtor Show, your one source for selling and buying real estate through trust and probate. Hear directly from the best attorneys and trusted advisors on how executors and administrators navigate the probate process in and out of court. Being a personal representative or successor trustee can be a daunting task, and often beneficiaries don't have a clear plan. Let us help you make the right decision for your clients, your family, and your legacy. And now, here's your host, the probate realtor himself, Matias Baker Masucci.
Welcome, everybody, to another very exciting episode of the Probate Realtor Show. Today, we are talking to Lindsay Altamirano. Lindsay, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Matias. I'm thrilled to be here and talk to you today about this stuff.
Awesome. It's such a pleasure to have you. Lindsay runs her own law firm, which is Alta Legacy Law, and she practices in the area of estate planning and trust administration. So we are going to dive right into it, and we're going to talk about the misconceptions that people encounter when dealing with estate planning. So let's start with that. What are some of the common misconceptions that you have run across?
I would say the most staggering and the one I'm most passionate about is that folks think it just simply doesn't apply to them. And it's not because they've done the research and they're like, no, it's good. It's not for me. It's really because I think we live in an age of so much information. It's hard to dig through what's real, right? There's misinformation about estate planning on the internet. There's lack of information. So I think people are still operating off the narrative that estate planning is for when you're a senior citizen, and that could not be more wrong, right? So or that it's just for rich people, which I also think that term is incredibly relative. Like it really depends on rich how, right? So the biggest one is that, because it's the biggest barrier for people getting their planning done. So I always try to tell people, the word estate is not that fancy as you think. It's what the IRS thinks you own. That's pretty much it. That's the biggest one, because that's the one I have the hardest time overcoming for people and say it actually applies to you. And I love saying, if you're 18 and over, estate planning applies to you, and you just be surprised how much it does apply to you. Especially here in California.
Right, exactly. Because I was going to say, actually, because people are like, if you own a house in LA, you're rich.
You are rich.
Yes. Right? Because there are limits, when an estate doesn't have to be probated, but the limits are so low, right?
Incredibly low. Yeah, thank you, Matias, because they raise it a little bit every so often. And basically what that means is, when you pass, all the things you own, not in a trust especially, are under about, it's a very odd number, like 180 something thousand, then you can skip any sort of probate process. But how many people in California, right, going back to real estate, does that even apply to?
Very few. And especially if you own any assets that are large enough to have to go through probate, the people who are left behind will have to pay a lot of money if you don't do any estate planning. Another thing that I wanted to talk to you about, it's, I guess, that people, you are relatively young, you look relatively young. So therefore, I always talk about this. There are attorneys who have been practicing for 60 years, right? So they have their clients for 60 years, and it's easier to communicate that proposition of saying, like when somebody goes to them, it's like, you're 85, we should do some estate planning. Like you said, the younger generations don't really understand the need for estate planning. So I guess my question is that, how do you communicate, to people that are, in their 20s, in their 30s, in their 40s, and are thinking, no, I don't really need to do that. What is some of the, I guess, the things that you let them know to understand that it's what's important?
Well, I try to first understand where they're coming from. Are they an individual, no kids, no spouse, and own certain things, right? And in that case, and that's where I bring in my college kids, my young adults. When you're an 18-year-old, you're now a legal adult, which means legally your parents can't make decisions for you. And that even applies for you're having a serious medical issue like a coma. God forbid you're in a car crash and you're on life support. And I think Terry Schiavo, and there's a few other ladies around that time frame, really brought that notion to light that, it's not as simple as, my family will take care of it. it's more than ever, it's not that simple. We're in a very liability focused country, and everyone's afraid of being sued for taking the wrong person's answer. So that's a big one for the young ones, just capacity. If you lack legal capacity, don't you want to be in charge of who makes that decision? And don't you want it to avoid going through the court system too? And then older people, do you have kids? The biggest pain point there is, what if the worst thing happens to me? And I know it's scary for people to think about, but if you just throw it out there, let's just make this decision, have some peace of mind. Just the more you talk about it, the less scary it becomes to talk about, I find. And then it goes up from there, right? You have kids. Do you have a home? Do you have more assets? Do you have charitable aspirations? I always tell people it's okay to be selfish when it comes to estate planning. The more planning you do, the more control you have over what happens to your things when you pass and what happens to you if you have any incapacity. The less planning you do, is you have a significantly less control over that whole process.
That makes total sense. It's in your answer is actually great because you started to dissect the elements of an estate plan. Because one of the things that people don't realize is that you're not planning on what happens to your stuff. That's not the only thing you're planning. You're also planning about incapacitation, right? You can get into a car accident, you could be incapacitated. And we all know, it's been in the media and the press, how conservatorships can be problematic for people. So that is, something that you could do by, preventing, making sure you decide who is in charge should the situation happen. Absolutely. Another thing that you talked about, it's a healthcare directive you talked about, which I think it's great. And obviously, very important for me as a father, I guess that's a very important aspect. It's you get to name the legal guardians of your children. So what I wanted to talk to you about, Lindsay, is essentially, if you don't make those decisions, who makes those decisions for you?
Yeah, so it goes 0 to 60. And if you're not around, either you've passed away or you have an incapacity, which I also mentioned too, that includes cognitive impairment like Alzheimer's and other dementias. Generally speaking, obviously there's variables to the whole area of estate planning, but generally speaking, we're in court. And I'm in court quite often. 50% of my practice is post-death or incapacity work. And we're leaving it up to, one judge most of the time, sort of the end of these decisions. And they're humans too. They get about 5 minutes to understand the situation, and we hope they're in a good mood, but they are especially in Los Angeles County, they're some of the most impacted calendars. I was in court yesterday. They have 35 hearings 35 cases every morning. You're leaving up to so many variables. And also some people, not everybody, you could have a lot of infighting going on, right? If you don't name, especially guardians, there could be a lot of people saying, I was supposed to be it. Well, I was supposed to be it. So now we're dragging out this and leaving up to a judge to decide who that person should be. And they don't know you. They're just getting evidence. So,
I want to make an example. Yes, a client asked me something last week. They asked me, is that legally binding? It was related to and the answer that I wanted to give them is that was going to depend to a judge and a jury ultimately, because I could tell you whatever I want, but there, even though the law tries to be consistent, there is definitely a concerted effort, in case law and all of that. We try to be stare decisis. The law tries to be consistent, but you are exactly what you're saying. You're leaving it up to a judge, and in the case of probate court, I think the cases where you can, I think it's only conservatorship when you can have a jury involved. So you're really leaving it up to somebody else to make those decisions for you. So it's a great point, and thank you for bringing that up. I wanted to ask you something. As you deal with the court, I guess you kind of open up the door to your involvement in the post-death process. How is that when you are doing the estate planning? How are you letting your clients know, hey, when something happens, you're not alone. I'm still here. I'm not giving you a packet and telling you, okay, see ya. When this becomes active, when the trust becomes irrevocable, I'm here. How do you communicate that? How do they understand that you are there for them?
Yeah, in fact, 90% of them ask me, well, can my kids call you? I'm like, absolutely. They're not. the drafting attorney, as we call it, is not, you're not required to use them in the post-death process, but
Right.
oftentimes if you have an attorney like myself who values the relationship, the adult kids will give a call. And even if they don't use your services in that way, I think it's so great for every trustee, successor trustee, if there's a trust, or potential administrator for going through probate court, just get at least an hour with an attorney. It's such a bumpy road. And as professionals, we're here to take care of that piece, because there's grieving going on. There's family feelings coming up. So I'll tell them, like, yeah, if I'm still in practice, which is the goal, because I am on the younger side, have the successor give me a call, and I'll just, we'll see if I'm a fit to help administration or get them pointed in the right direction.
Excellent. Okay, let's pivot a little bit. Still, one of the things that we talked about the misconceptions about estate planning, which is that, that's really something that applies to people who have not made the decision. What I wanted to talk to you about is when a family has made the decision, a family or an individual has made the decision, and they come to you. So they are already ready to do the estate planning. However, there may be challenges along the way, like I want to disinherit this child, or I don't know, there could be plenty of them. I don't want to disclose to my spouse that I own this. I don't know what the circumstances are, but I kind of want to say, how do you help overcome, some of the challenges that are presented during the process of doing an estate plan?
Well, for me, that's where I shine, I guess, when it comes to the purpose of hiring the estate planning attorney to do it. We spend what I call the design meeting really brainstorming. And my biggest thing I ask them is, tell me your pain points. What's your goals? What's your concerns? You don't need to know how to write it. I want to hear what's concerning you. And especially at this point in my practice, I've been through so many iterations of situations that what I do is combine my recommendations, which includes practicality, right? We want it to be practical too in the administrative point, with their goals. So there's so many ways, especially with the trust, that you can do that. So for them, what seems like, how are we even going to do this? I'm here to go, okay, let me give you some options. We can do it this way and this way, but I think this will give you the best approach for your goal and concern, which includes disinheriting or uneven distributions sometimes, which we put some extra measures in place for that. Or blended families is a big thing. Kids from a prior marriage, how are we addressing it? And especially when I'm working with married couples, I tell them, I go, by the way, I can't keep anything from your other spouse. So don't tell me something you don't want them to know. but just helping them come to an agreement on something that's a nice compromise that makes them both feel comfortable. So we spend a lot of time on that. That's probably the lump sum of the planning process.
Very nice. Very nice. Thank you for sharing that. Now let's talk about how your background has informed the way you practice. You have an interesting background in peace studies, and so I'm kind of curious, how has that shaped the way you approach your practice today?
It's funny you asked that, because someone was asking me about my background earlier this week. And they were surprised to know I'm a history buff. Ever since I was a little kid, big history buff, which led me into my undergraduate degree, which was history and including peace and conflict studies. I think, like most people my age, our age, I wanted to save the world. I didn't know what that meant. I wanted to save the world. And I somehow ended up as a lawyer. And I had a really incredible professor in law school who helped me understand what I wanted to do with my legal career. And he asked me a really great question that I think applies to what I'm doing today. And he said, Lindsay, do you want to impact a group of people and maybe not see that impact for a while? Or do you want to impact one person and see a more immediate result and impact? I thought I was going to pick the former based on all my interest in what I've studied. And I like the latter. And that's what I feel like I do every day. I impact one person. I see an immediate impact, advocacy being the biggest thing. Speaking up for someone who doesn't know the legal process, especially in probate. I've had some interesting cases where I've said, we're going to go full argument. We're going to hope the judge likes our answer. And winning someone's house back when we thought it was never going to happen. I mean, that's that person's whole world. So maybe it's not on a grand scale of saving the world or saving a country or anything, but to that person it was. It came full circle in practicing this area of law.
I'm a strong believer in what you said. I believe, I always tell when people talk to me about, what's going on the other side of the world or something, that I often use the line, I have a very provincial mind, which kind of shocks people. I'm saying, I'm interested in being kind to the neighbor next door because I have, that's kind of like the impact that I can have. I understand, and my children, and, it's kind of like so I totally get it. And I see how that crossroad, that decision, can make, it was a good question. You're right. Your law professor asked you a very interesting question. Something that you mentioned during your answer, which actually piqued my curiosity. You talked about, the I don't want to use the word litigation necessarily, but you talked about challenging that you have to find yourself in court when you have to argue something, et cetera, et cetera. How is that? That obviously is, we have an adversarial system in the United States. So if there's another party that thinks opposite to you, how have you, been able to develop a strategy, I guess, based in your practice where, you're able to present a case, except, how has that changed? Has it changed over the years? And if so, how is that? How's your background informed that?
Yeah, it's funny because I am not big on conflict. I don't like conflict. But I am so thrilled to have a litigation background. My whole career has involved litigation, and it's changed a lot. I've become more confident. So these days, I feel when you're passionate about what you do and you're passionate about your client's position, it just, you feel like you're doing a mini save the world, kind of like what I said. And so I feel it's an exciting challenge because I'm going in there with a good position to do something for my client that is the right thing. And so it feels rewarding in that sense. And nothing like calling a client after a hearing to say, hey, guess what? It worked.
Let's talk about the difference between the challenging cases and the straightforward cases. Do you gravitate toward, a specific, like, oh, when there's something that we can solve this complex thing, this complex problem, which one do you find on your desk happening more often? The ones that are like straightforward administration and process or planning, or do you deal more often with cases that are like, oh my God, I can't believe we have 10 children. This one was, nobody knew about this child, and the beneficiaries live in Brazil, or whatever the circumstances may be?
Lately it's the latter. And partially it's because there are oftentimes when you start a case and then information comes out and you were not planning on that information. So now your whole strategy has changed. I would like to say I love looking for those cases, but there are definitely other lawyers that they thrive off of that. And it's great because we need them to. We need them to find these crazy situations. But I like to mix it with a nice, clean, straightforward probate administration. But those cases that are not straightforward, they really teach you a lot. And I have a lot of international elements lately as well. It's just fascinating how much you learn trying to find an argument that isn't necessarily very common, but is there. It's based in law, and you just hope the judge agrees with you as well.
That makes sense. I'm going to ask you a question that at first I'm going to preface the fact that I hate asking these questions, but I'm going to ask it anyway because I think it'd be interesting with the way this conversation is going. There's a lot of people that do what you do out there. So when somebody is looking for somebody that, what would make them gravitate towards you? What do you feel? I don't necessarily need you to answer the question, what makes you different from others? I don't like that question. But for a consumer, what do you think would make him gravitate towards you as opposed to someone else?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question to ask. I know I hesitate, but it is important because there are a lot of people that do what I do, and I don't pretend there are not. Especially when you have your own practice, you probably should be more competitive than I am, and I just am not, because usually when someone picks me, they just like me. It sounds so silly to say, or there's just some connection. They feel comfortable with me in some way. That's why I find that sort of introductory call I do with people so important, because they're about to open up their whole life to me. And many people too, they find a connection because of my connection to the Alzheimer's disease. And so that's sort of an instant door opener, that personal understanding. But usually, yeah, it's just that we've connected in some way. So it's hard to quantify or qualify, but
Yeah,
I
of
guess
course.
that's the best.
I get it. Yeah. Now let's talk about the connection with Alzheimer's. This is an important topic that we need to discuss. Share that with our audience, please.
Yeah, so my grandmother, who passed away last year from Alzheimer's, had been living with it for almost 7 years, and
Okay.
she was just as important to me as my mother, my own mother, one of my biggest cheerleaders in my life. And when she was diagnosed, I thought, wow, I have to do something, going back to saving the world. So I started with volunteering with the Alzheimer's Association, the local chapter, and I still do to this
Wow.
day. It's the way I sort of give back and become part of a community of folks that are going through it. And unfortunately, the community is getting bigger and bigger, fortunately and unfortunately.
Right.
And it just happens to blend in with what I do for a living.
Right.
But it's a very, very important, and it makes me even more passionate about people getting their estate plan done. Because to have a loved one going through Alzheimer's and then needing a conservatorship just to make decisions on their behalf, it's just, it's unfathomable.
Right.
So yeah, I right now at this point for the association, I'm a community educator, which means I'm a volunteer who presents their different free programming on different topics related to Alzheimer's Association.
That's great. I love the fact that, it touched you personally. Now, when this happened, what was where in your law career were you when you first became into contact with, Alzheimer on a personal level?
It's funny because I was just switching over to trust and estates law, like just barely switching over to the area, not related at all. My decision was not related at all. I just was finding myself in this practice area, and it sort of just worked. But yeah, I was just getting started.
Interesting.
Yeah.
One of the questions that I love to ask is, okay, so when you were in law school, well, actually, first let me ask you this, because I love to ask these questions. Did you want to be an attorney when you were a kid?
No, I never ever thought I would be.
All right, tell me, what did you want to be when you were a kid?
A veterinarian or marine biologist.
Okay.
I love animals.
Marine biologist, that's interesting. My wife wanted to be a marine biologist.
Is she also afraid of sharks?
That's sure. That could be one of the reasons. Okay, so definitely not an attorney. So what happens in law school? What happens, I guess, when you made the decision? Because your undergraduate degree, as you said, you weren't necessarily, were you already planning to go to law school, or is that something that happened later?
It happened probably between junior and senior year of college. Is when I decided. I had a friend who was thinking about going to law school. Incidentally, she never went. She did something else. And I just looked at one of her law school applications and I thought, well, maybe I do this. I knew I wanted to get more education.
Okay.
I love history, but I didn't want to be a historian by career. And so I thought, well, why don't I go to law school? I went to law school with people that knew they wanted to be a district attorney for their whole life. I was like, well, I don't know yet.
Yeah.
This is interesting stuff.
So what happens after you got out of law school? What was your first, sort of like professional assignment, if you will?
Yeah, I was hired by a firm that I was a law clerk for in the summer. So it was a civil litigation firm, and they did insurance defense, which I had never heard of until that time. And a lot of my cases involved medical malpractice or just various personal injury, right? So the insurance company is the client. And it was a crash course in litigation. I went to court 3 times my first week after getting my license. And so I am so grateful for that piece. It was not what I wanted to do for the rest of my life, but it was a good start.
Yeah, right. That makes sense. Now, before I let you go, I want to, we are obviously going to have your contact information in our show notes. But what is the best way to get a hold of you?
Phone call, which my receptionist answers 24/7. Not that you need to call me at midnight, but just so that there's always someone to answer your call, or by email at my email address.
Perfect. Can you give the number and email out?
Sure. My phone number is 424-242-5021. And my email is Lindsay, LINDSAY, @altalegacylaw.com.
Perfect. Lindsay, it's been such a pleasure to have you on the show. Thank you so much for your time. I really enjoyed our conversation together. And do you have any parting words for our audience?
Just try to get past the fear and start doing some research on getting your estate plan done.
Perfect. Thank you so much. All right, everybody. Thank you for joining us, and we will see you on the next episode. Bye.
Thank you for listening to the Probate Realtor Show. Find more episodes and interact with us at probaterealtor.la. That's probaterealtor.la. Listen, ask questions, and get results. Don't forget to like and subscribe. The Probate Realtor Matias Baker Masucci is a licensed real estate broker in California, DRE number 020547763. Any legal information provided is for informational purposes only and not for the purpose of providing legal advice. Contact an attorney to obtain advice with respect to any particular legal issue or problem. We make no guarantees as to the accuracy of any information. Thank you again for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode.